Let's start by talking about what macros are and when you would use one. Macros are one of the component objects of an Access database. Like tables, queries, forms, and reports, macros serve a specialized role in the system. They allow database developers to connect objects together and add functionality and interactivity to the database. For instance, when a user clicks on a form that you've designed, a macro will tell the system what actions to perform and in what order. Microsoft Access actually provides database developers with two control objects that can add functionality and interactivity to the database. You can find them both on the Create tab in the Macros and Code group. The first is a code module, and it requires that developers can read and write code in the Visual Basic programming language. It's a great flexible choice for seasoned programmers, but it has a steep learning curve for people that are new to Access development and is sometimes overkill for many common tasks. Further, using VBA code in your database projects opens them up to security concerns, and safety-conscious end users might disable the use of Visual Basic on their machines, effectively breaking the functionality of your database. The other option for adding functionality and interactivity is the macro object. Macro objects can accomplish many of the same tasks as Visual Basic code, but are considered to be much safer. They don't require users to trust the database in order to function, as they're not given the same level of system-wide permissions as VB code modules can have. Further, macros are created using a simple graphical interface, and don't require writing or reading lines of code. You'll never have to worry about a macro generating an error because you forgot a closing parenthesis or having an extra comma somewhere. Now, many versions ago, macros were very limited in scope and were often avoided by professional developers. However, Microsoft has added lots of functionality to the macro objects over the years, and now they're quite viable to use in a large number of situations. Many of the most common database tasks can be accomplished with a macro, from running action queries and navigating through forms to selecting and editing records in a table. Even more advanced programmatic techniques, such as using variables and conditional logic, can be performed with macros in Access. Macros can be standalone objects that live in the database's navigation pane, just like all of your other database objects. They can also be embedded inside of other objects, such as a button on a form. If you were to make a copy of that button, the macro comes right along with it. This makes it really easy to reuse assets that you've previously built in other places throughout the database, which makes the experience more consistent for your end users and speeds up development for you. Now, I should also take a moment to clarify that macros in Access differ from macros in other Office programs, such as Excel and Word. In those programs, you have the option to record a series of steps while you work, and then replay those steps back again. When you record a macro in Excel and Word, Visual Basic code is being written in the background. In Access, macros are very different. Macros in Access can't simply be recorded, and they don't use Visual Basic code at all. Instead, you'll create a list of steps to perform through choices available in an action catalog. The resulting sequence is its own complete object. It doesn't require Visual Basic permissions to execute and run, unlike those macros in Excel and Word. Access macros can accomplish a wide range of tasks and become even more powerful when you string together a series of actions in a sequence. Let's get started by taking a look at the macro designer and see what actions we have at our disposal. To do that, I'll come up here to the Create tab, and on the far right in the Macros and Code group, I'm going to click on the Macro button. This will open it up in Design View. Now, the first thing to notice is that there's only one contextual tab for macros called Design. Also notice on the left that there's no View button, we just have this one button called Run. If I switch over to the Home tab, you'll notice that the View button there is grayed out and inaccessible. So macros only have the one view, and that's the Design view. Let's go back to the Design tab. The main portion of the interface has a simple drop-down menu. This will display all the actions that you can choose from for your macro to perform. At the top are a couple of program flow components, comment, group, if, and submacro, and then below that is an alphabetized list of macro actions. You can scroll through this list, it's quite long, and you can see all the different actions that we can choose from. Let's choose a basic one to get started called Message Box. You can either scroll through the list until you find it, or you can simply start typing up here at the top. I'll type mess, and it'll jump right to Message Box. Go ahead and press Enter to select it. When you've chosen an action, it expands to display all the arguments or the details that you'll need to fill in for your chosen action. The Message Box action needs to know the message content, whether to beep or not when it displays, the type of message, and the title for the message window. Notice that some of these arguments have drop-down menus or choices we can choose from. For instance, for beep, we have the option of yes or no, and for the type, we have none, critical, two different warnings, and information. This property defines the icon that will appear on our message box and should be used to convey the seriousness of the message. The other arguments all have free-fill text boxes that you can type whatever you want in. Notice that as soon as I click off of the message text box, that it fills in with the word required. This way, we can see that the message is a required argument of the message box action, but the title is not. When you click off of the step, it becomes deselected. You'll click on it again to select it if you need to make any changes. If you want to remove the action, simply press on the black X in the upper right-hand corner of the action while it's selected. Another way to add action steps rather than through the drop-down menu is to use the Action Catalog. If you're not seeing it on your window, you can turn it on with this button here on the Design tab. In the Action Catalog, actions are grouped together by function. You can find the message box action underneath the User Interface Commands group here. And there it is right there. To add it in, simply double-click on it, and that'll add that action after the currently selected action in the macro sequence. One of the benefits of the Action Catalog is that you can read a description of each action at the bottom of the window. This is helpful for making sure that you've got the right one selected. It also gives you easy access to the documentation for each action. Simply hover your mouse over the action step, and in the pop-up menu, click on the Tell Me More button. That'll open up the help documentation for the action and give you all the details that you need. I'll also point out at the top of the Action Catalog that you have a search field that you can use to easily find actions. For instance, I'll go ahead and type menu, and it'll show me all the actions that have menu in the name, such as Run Menu Command and Add Menu. It'll also search through the descriptions. For instance, Run Macro doesn't have menu in the name, but if I take a look down here, it has menu in the description. The search box can also be helpful if you know the name of an action, but don't know what category that it belongs to. For instance, I can come back up here to the search box and type in message, and I can see that the message box action occurs inside of the User Interface Commands group. So let's go ahead and fill in the details for our message box action. You can type in whatever you'd like here. For the message, I'm going to type in, this is my first macro. For beep, I'm going to change that to no. For type, I'm going to choose the information option. And for title, I'll just call it success. I can also add in a comment block to the macro to document what it does. I'll come back over here to the Action Catalog and click on the button on the right side of the filter to clear it out. Then I'll double click on comment to add in a new comment block. And I'll type in, this macro is the first step on a journey of discovery. When I click off of the comment, it formats it green, so it's easy to distinguish the comment from the actual steps of the macro. Comments are a great addition to help users know what a macro is supposed to do, and it's always a good idea to provide that kind of documentation in your work. Let's go ahead and save this macro. I'll press the Ctrl+S keyboard shortcut, or you can press the disk icon on the Quick Access toolbar, and I'll call this First Macro. That'll save it down here into the navigation pane under a new group called Macros. And now we can go ahead and close out of the design view of our macro, and that'll return me back to the H+ Sport main menu. In order to run my macro, I simply double-click on it in the navigation pane. And here I can see my message box. Notice that the rest of the Access interface is locked out while the message box is displayed on the screen. This is a modal property of message boxes that forces the user to read and dismiss the window before moving on to their next task. To get back into the Design view to edit the macro, you'll need to right-click on it in the navigation pane and choose Design View from the pop-up menu. That'll get us right back in where we can continue to make changes. And that's our first macro. The Action Catalog provides an easy way to see all of the actions that we can choose from and provides some helpful information about what each action does. Then, once you've chosen your action, you'll need to fill in the parameters specific to your database. Macro objects allow you to create a series of actions that you'd like to automate. When the macro is triggered, Access runs through the steps and performs the tasks for you. There's lots of different uses for macros in your database, and the benefit of using them is that every time that they're triggered, the macro will perform the exact same steps in the exact same order, regardless of what user initiated the process. This makes them invaluable in ensuring that different users will get the same results, especially on more complex multi-step processes. Let's suppose that I want to start each day with two very specific pieces of information from the database opened up for me to review. I'd like to see the most recent orders from the orders table. If I open it up, we'll see that I have a total of 3,472 orders. I'd just like to see the orders from the last 180 days, and have them presented in a reverse chronological order so that the most recent are at the top. I'd also like to see the customer lifetime sales report. If I open that up, we'll see that it totals every customer in every state. Let's suppose that I just want to see the people that have spent over $1,000 across all of their orders. In order to get both of these objects set up, it's going to take a number of clicks and filters. Conveniently, this is a perfect use for a macro instead. Let's go ahead and close out of this report, and I'll close the table as well. Then we'll go to the Create tab, and I'll start creating a new macro. If your Action Catalog isn't open up on the screen, you can toggle it on by pressing the Action Catalog button here on the ribbon. Then I'm going to go into the Database Objects folder and double-click on Open Table. That'll add in the first step of my macro. The table name that I want to open is the Orders table. I can go ahead and either type it in or select it from the drop-down menu. And I want to open it up in the data mode called Read Only. I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally making changes to the table while I'm reviewing it. Next, I want to filter down the results in this table. We can do that by going back to the Action Catalog, and I'll collapse the Database Objects folder and open up the folder called Filter Query Search. Then I'll add in the action called Apply Filter by double-clicking on it, and that'll add in step number 2. We're going to come down to the Where Condition argument, and this will be the same condition that you would put into a query's criteria row to filter the records, or in an SQL statement's where clause. I only want to see the orders that are within the past 180 days, so I can make reference to the order date column by typing that in square brackets. And I want to say greater than a date that's 180 days in the past. I can do that by calculating today's date by using the date function. I'll type in open parentheses to close this whole statement. The date function doesn't have any arguments of its own, so I'll just open and close parentheses there. Then I'll subtract 180 from that, and I'll finish that with a closing parenthesis. So essentially what we're doing is getting today's date with this function, and we're subtracting 180 days from that. That'll find a date that's 180 days in the past. Then I want to filter my table to just those orders that have an order date that's after that date in the past. So that finishes the filter. Let's come down to the next step. I also wanted to sort my records. I can come back to the Filter Query Search folder and double-click on Set Order By to add in that action. Then we're going to order by the order date column. Now if I just left it like this, it's going to sort it ascending, so I need to specify DESC at the end to sort that column descending. That'll finish the table setup. Let's go ahead and add in the next action. We'll come back to the Database Objects folder, and this time we're going to Open Report. The report that I want to open is the Customer Lifetime Sales Report. I want to view it in Print Preview view. And we also wanted to apply a where condition to the report. I only wanted to see the customers that had a lifetime sales above $1,000. So I'll make a square bracket here, and I'll type in the reference to the lifetime sales column. And I'll simply say greater than 1,000. I'll click down at the bottom to deselect everything, and we'll take a look at the finished macro. If I want to collapse the steps, I can do that by coming up here into the ribbon and pressing the Collapse Actions button. That'll reduce everything to a single line, so I can see the action name and the arguments in parentheses. I can also press the Expand Actions button to re-expand them open again. Let's go ahead and save this macro. I'll call it Morning Review. And then I'll save it down here in the navigation pane. Now we can go ahead and close it down, and I'll test it out by double-clicking on it. That'll open up both the Orders table and the Customer Lifetime Sales Report. If I take a look at the report, we'll see just the customers that have spent over $1,000 with the company. And if I take a look at the Orders table, we'll see that it's returning just the most recent order dates, and it's sorted reverse chronologically. Now keep in mind that the results that I'm getting here on the Orders table is based off of the day that I'm recording this movie. Remember that we're filtering the records to just the ones that are within 180 days of the day that this macro is being run. It's likely that you'll have fewer records returned, or none at all, and you can simply adjust the date range in the macro's design as needed. And with that, we have my completed Morning Review macro. It goes through a number of steps to quickly bring up the exact information that I'd like to review when I sit down at my desk at the start of each day. In order for a macro to begin running, it needs to be triggered. So far, we've done this by double-clicking on the name of the macro in the navigation pane of the database. And while that will work, it's not the best way for users to trigger a macro. A better option is to link the macro to some event in the interface that you've developed for your database, such as pressing a big, unambiguous button on a form. Let's go through the process of adding a button to initiate our Morning Review macro. I'm going to take the main menu form that I have open up here, and I'm going to switch it over into Design View. Then in the Design tab in the Controls group, I'm going to click on the button control, which is this one here with the rectangle and the 4 X's. I'll go ahead and click it once to select it, and then come down into my form and click again to add in a button. That'll start up the Command Button Wizard. In the wizard, we're prompted to select an action that we want to perform, and all of these will create a macro. But they're limited in scope, and using the wizard will limit the types of things that we can do with the macro. Besides that, we've already constructed the macro that we want to trigger with our button. So instead of using the wizard, I'm simply going to close it by pressing the cancel button. That'll leave me with a button here that's named Command 52 on my screen, and if I switch back into Form View, we'll see that clicking on it does absolutely nothing. Let's go back into Design View. I'm going to style this button a little bit. Let's go over here to the Format tab, and with it still selected, I'm going to click on Quick Styles, and then choose this orange color to make it match the rest of my buttons on the interface. Then I'll go ahead and resize it just by dragging on the corners. Next, I'm going to go to the Design tab and open up the Property sheet. On the Format tab, I'm going to change the caption from Command 52 to something that makes more sense. I'll have the button say, "Let's get started." Then on the other tab, I'm going to give my button a better name. I'll call it BTN Start. And next, I'll switch over to the Event tab. The Event tab lists all of the triggering events that we can tap into for this button, and you can see that there's a wide variety of events. The most common is the on-click event. This will define what will happen when the user clicks or presses this button. But you can see that we can trigger a macro when the user double-clicks a button. Or we can even have one macro trigger when the user clicks down on the button, and trigger a different macro when the user stops clicking with the mouse up event. So there's lots of options here, and you'll want to think through some standard interface interactions that your users are likely to make, and what will make sense for them. For instance, it might be confusing if a macro is triggered simply by the user moving their mouse across the button without actually clicking, which is what will happen if you use the mouse move event. To attach a macro to a specific event, you're simply going to use the drop-down menu in that property. I'll come back up here to the on-click event and use the drop-down menu to choose the morning review macro that we previously created. Then I can go ahead and close the property sheet. I'll save my form, and we'll switch into Form View and test it out. I'll press the Let's Get Started button, and I can see that my orders table and my lifetime sales report both open up. Let's go and close them back down again. Now, buttons aren't the only thing that you can use to trigger macros. In fact, every object and control in Access has events associated with them. If I go back into Design View and open up the Property sheet once again, I'll switch over to the properties for the form. Here on the Event tab, you can see that the form itself has lots of different triggering events that we can tap into. The onLoad event will trigger a macro as soon as the form is opened up. If we use the onClick event, that'll trigger anytime we click anywhere inside of the form. If I scroll down, we can see that we have some timer events as well. We have onTimer and the timer interval. These will trigger after a short delay that we specify when the form opens. If I scroll back up, we'll see that we have two called onGotFocus and onLostFocus. These will trigger when a user comes back to the form after working with something else, or onLostFocus when they transfer off of this form and go to a different report or a form, for instance. If I click on one of the combo boxes in the form, for instance this one here that says Unbound next to Year, we'll see that it also has lots of different triggering events that we can tap into. So as you can see, you have lots of options for controlling when the database triggers your macros and under what conditions. When macros are created using the button wizard, they don't save into the navigation pane. Instead, they get created inside of the object that they're attached to. We can see that by taking the main menu form and switching it into Design View. Then, in the Controls group, I'll click on the button, and we'll go down and we'll add in a new button into our form. That'll start up the Command Button Wizard. Now for this example, I'm going to go into the Report Operations category and choose the Mail Report action. This will email a report of our choosing. Go press the next button. Access will need to know which report we want to email. I'll choose the Orders by State report and press Next. Then we'll go ahead and define what we want to see on the button. I'm going to choose the text option, and we'll just leave it as Mail Report. I'll press Next, and we'll give our button a meaningful name. I'll call it BTN Mail Report. I'll press Finish to create my button. Now if we take a look at the property sheet for this button, I'll go ahead and make sure the button is selected. On the Event tab in the onClick event, we'll see that we have an embedded macro. I can edit this macro by clicking on the Build button that appears on the right-hand side of the property. This opens up the same macro design window that we've seen previously, but if you look at the title on the tab, it indicates that this is an embedded macro. We can see that we're looking in the main menu form, inside of the BTN Mail Report button, and inside of the OnClick event. Also notice that this macro just has a single action called Email Database Object. It has a couple of arguments that are already filled in, specifically the name of the report that we want to email. But there are a number of additional arguments that the wizard didn't even ask us about. We can fill in any of these additional details to save them into the macro, such as if we want this email to always go to the same person, we can fill in their email address in the To field. Or we can fill in any carbon copy or blind copy recipients. We can also hard code what type of file to export this report as by switching the Output Format option here, and I'll use the drop-down menu to either choose Excel file or HTML file or a PDF, for example. This way we don't have to choose which type of file every time we press this button. We can even specify a message subject or a body text we want to always include. The more details we fill out here, the less we'll need to fill in every time we trigger this macro. When you're done making changes, go ahead and close the macro by pressing the X in the tab bar. That'll prompt me to save the changes, and I'll say yes. And then I'll go ahead and update the embedded macro. If you ever want to remove an embedded macro from an object, all you need to do is simply go to the event and highlight the text and remove it. And you can always begin building an embedded macro without going through the wizard by starting with a blank event and pressing on the Build button on the far right. Then you'll choose to use the Macro Builder and press OK. That'll get you right back into a fresh design window to get started. There's one more way to trigger a macro that you should be aware of, and that's to do so automatically when the database opens. I'm going to make a copy of the morning review macro that we previously created by right-clicking on it and choosing Copy, and then right-clicking in the All Access Objects navigation pane and choosing Paste. That'll allow me to give it a new name here, and I'm going to give it a very special name called AUTOEXEC. This is an abbreviation for Auto Execute. I'll go press Enter, and that'll save it here in the navigation pane. Anytime an Access database starts up that includes a macro with this name, it'll run the macro before performing any other tasks. Let's go ahead and close down the database now and test it out. I get this prompt that the clipboard is about to be emptied, and that's totally fine. I'll press the Yes button there, and that'll finish closing out the database. Then I'll simply start up the database again. The file that I was working with was called H+Sport Auto Execute, and I'll double-click on it to run it. When the database starts up, it automatically runs the Auto Execute macro. And you can see that I get my orders table here with the proper filtering, as well as the customer lifetime sales report. So it looks like that macro was triggered as expected. Now sometimes you might want to open up a database that has an Auto Execute macro without actually triggering the macro. In order to do that, what we need to do is close the database again. Then we'll come back out to Windows Explorer. I'll click on the database file one time to highlight it, and then hold down the Shift key on my keyboard. And while I continue to hold down that Shift key, then I'll double click on that file to open it up. With the Shift key held down when your database starts up, that'll go ahead and bypass many of the startup options that we have in Access, including firing the Auto Execute macro. Notice also that our main menu didn't open up. So holding down that Shift key will keep your macro from automatically firing. The Auto Execute macro is a great little hidden feature that can help get your users to where they need to go as soon as they open up the database. It's possible to store several independent macro routines inside of a single macro. Similar to the way that forms can contain buttons or tables can contain columns, macros can contain essentially other macros. I want to create a series of macros that'll export my order data for each month to separate Excel spreadsheets. I could create a macro for each month, but it'll be more organized if I create each of them as sub-macros inside of a single macro object. Let's start the process by going to the Create tab and creating a new macro. From the Action Catalog, I'm going to double-click on Sub-Macro, and that'll create a new titled sub-macro that I can call independently of other sub-macros inside of this macro. I'm going to call this January. Then, inside of the sub-macro, we'll simply list out the action steps. I want to export my orders table, so the first thing I need to do is open the table. I'll type in open table here inside of the first action, and press enter to see its arguments. The table that I want to open is going to be the orders table, so I'll select it from the list. We can view it in datasheet view, but I want to change the edit mode from edit to read only. Then once that table is open, I need to filter it down to just see the records from January. I'll use the apply filter action. Here we're going to apply a where condition to filter the records. I only want to see the records from the month of January, so I'm going to use the month function, and I'm going to apply it to the order date data column. The month function will return a number that represents the month of the year, and so I want to see only January, so I'll say equals 1. That'll filter down my records to just January. Once I have the filter, I can go ahead and export that to an Excel file. I'll use the export with formatting action for the next step. The object type that I want to export is a table. The object name is the orders table. The output format I can hard code here to an Excel file. I'll go ahead and choose Excel workbook from the list. For the output file, I need to specify the path on my computer that I want this to go to. I'm going to go back into the exercise files for this computer, and we're going to right-click in the URL bar and choose copy address inside of the Chapter 2 folder. Then I can go back into my Access database and right-click in the output file field and choose paste to paste in the path to that folder. Then I'll put it in another backslash, and I'll just call this jan.xlsx. And finally, with the export complete, we can go ahead and close the orders table. I'll go down and add another action here, and it'll simply be the close window action. The object type will be table again, and the object name will be the orders table. So that finishes my January submacro. I can go ahead and scroll through this list if I want to reread everything, or I can press the collapse all button to reduce it down to just the name of the submacro. Let's go ahead and press the expand all button again, and then I'll press collapse actions to just see the individual actions on a single line. This makes it a little bit easier to read the action name as well as the arguments inside of the parentheses for each step. So this completes the submacro for January. I essentially want to do the same thing for the other months. So what I can do is make sure that the submacro is selected. It has this gray box around it, and I'll press Ctrl+C on my keyboard to copy it. Then I'll click down here in the blank section at the bottom below New Action, and I'll press Ctrl+V. That'll paste in a copy of the submacro, and I can simply rename it to February. Then I'll go into the Apply Filter action here, and I need to change this where condition from equals 1 to equals 2. And then I need to go into the Export with Formatting action. We'll expand that, and I'll change the file name that we're exporting here from jan.xlsx to feb.xlsx. So that completes the February submacro. Let's do this one more time for March. We'll go ahead and select it again. Copy it to the clipboard, paste another copy of it, go ahead and scroll down here. I'll change the submacro name to March, and make the same edits to the where condition, equals 3, and the export with formatting step, I'll export it to mar.xlsx. With all those changes made, let's go ahead and collapse everything, and I want to actually expand all and then press collapse action so I can see each action on its own line. And we can take a look through just to make sure that all those changes were made properly. Everything looks good. Let's go ahead and save the macro now. I'll call it simply export, and press OK, and that'll save it down here into the navigation pane. Now, if I were just to simply double click on the export macro, it's only going to run the first submacro, this January portion of the macro. Instead, what I need to do is provide buttons that'll link directly to each submacro inside of the export macro. I'll go ahead and close the macro down. That'll return us to the main menu form, and I'll take that into Design View. Then on the Design tab, I'll grab a button control object, and we'll come down to the bottom, and actually going to scroll down a little bit, and we'll click down here at the very bottom to add a new button in. Now, I'm not going to use the command button wizard, so I'll press the cancel button. Then I'll double click on the button to just rename it to just simply Jan, and I'll resize it just a little bit to make it smaller. Next, I'm going to open up the property sheet for this and take a look at the event tab of the property sheet. And if I expand the drop-down menu on the on-click event, you'll see how these sub-macros will display. We have a reference to just the overall macro, but then each sub-macro gets listed down below with the dot and then the name of the sub-macro. So I have export.january, export.february, and export.march. Let's go and link this button to the export.january sub-macro. Then I'm going to make a copy of this button. I'll go ahead and select it, press Ctrl+C on the keyboard, and Ctrl+V to paste in the copy. Let's go ahead and move this into position, and I'll double-click to name it Feb. Then we'll link its onClick event to export.february. And we'll do the same thing for a button for March. Go ahead and select the button again, press copy, press paste, and go ahead and move this into position. Double click to rename it. And with it still selected, I'll change its onClick event to export.march. So now if I click through each of these buttons, we should see their onClick event reference the proper sub-macro inside of the export macro. So I have export.january, export.february, and export.march. Let's quickly get a title here to this section. I'll add a label object. Come down and I'll just type in export order data. And I'll quickly go to the Format tab. I'll color it bold and black. Let's go ahead and close the property sheet. We'll save the form. And I'll go over here to the Design tab and switch back into Form View. And we'll test everything out. Let's go press the January button. Order table opens for a second, then closes again. I'll do the same thing with February. And with the March button. Now if everything's working, I should be able to go back out to my exercise folders, and we'll find we have a new January Excel file, March, and here's February here at the top. And if I open up each one, we should just see the order dates that fall inside of that month. So here's all the dates inside of February. So using subroutines can be a useful technique for keeping the navigation pane organized. One method that I've seen is to create a single macro for each form in the database, and use subroutines for every macro that form needs to use to function. This makes it easy to quickly look through the navigation pane and know exactly what macro objects relate to which forms. Conditional macros allow you to build in a branching decision structure that can respond to a variety of situations, rather than running straight through every action listed in the macro from top to bottom. These follow the common if-then-else structure that's common to every programming language. Let's take a look at how this works with a macro that'll tell us what day of the week it is. We'll start by going to the Create tab and creating that new macro. Then in the Action Catalog, I'll double click on the if statement to add in an if block here to my macro. The first thing I need to do is fill in the condition. This expression will need to evaluate to either a true statement or a false statement. For this example, I want to test to see what day of the week it is, and for that I'll use the weekday function. The weekday function will evaluate a date and return an integer between 1 and 7. 1 represents Sunday, 2 represents Monday, and so on. In order to see what today is, we can use the date function inside of it. I'll type in date, and then an open parenthesis, and then a closing parenthesis. The date function will return today's date. We'll go ahead and close the finished weekday statement with another closing parenthesis. So if the weekday of the date is equal to 1, if that's true, then this if statement will continue on with the next action down below. I'll create a simple message box here. For the message, I'll type in today is Sunday. If this condition, the weekday of the date equals 1, if that returns a false, then it means that the day that you're running the macro is not a Sunday. And Access will skip over that message box action and move on. We can add over here using these links, we can add an else statement that'll capture all other cases. Or we can add an else if statement if we want to evaluate a second condition. Let's go ahead and add an else if statement. Then for the else if statement, I'll type weekday of the date is equal to 2. If this is true, then it means it's a Monday, so I'll add another message box action here. And for the message, I'll type today is Monday. I'll continue adding else if statements to the chain and modify it for each day of the week. Now that all those are filled in, I can go ahead and collapse all of the actions to see a more compact view of my macro. I can read through it a little bit easier. So if the weekday of the date equals 1, then we're going to have a message box that says today is Sunday. If it's equal to 2, then today is Monday. 3 is equal to Tuesday. 4 is Wednesday. 5 is Thursday. 6 is Friday. And finally 7 is Saturday. Let's go ahead and save this macro, and I'll call it day verification. And then I'll save it down into the navigation pane. We'll go ahead and close it. And I'll double click on it to run. The macro returns a message box that says today, the day that I'm recording this movie, is a Wednesday, which is correct. Hopefully you're getting the correct day for when you're following along. So the conditional if statement, it skips over all of the conditions that are false and only processes the actions listed under a true condition. Using this structure, you can have your macros respond to a wide variety of situations. Access macros support the use of variables that can be set, modified, and removed over the course of the macro's execution. We'll go ahead and run it, and that'll remove that variable from memory. So with variables, you can pull the values from your database or ask for them on the fly, and then use those as inputs in calculations in the macro or elsewhere in the system. Macros can pull information from other objects to be used in their execution. If I open up the employee directory, either by double-clicking on it here in the navigation pane, or simply pressing this big button here on the main menu, that'll open it up, and you'll see that it's a long, continuous form that I can scroll through to see all the different employees' contact information. Now, it's a little bit cumbersome to scroll to the correct employee, so what I want to do is return to the main menu, and I want to put a text box here on the main menu form that I can type in an employee ID number and then jump right to the contact information for that specific employee. Let's start the process by taking this main menu into Design View. Then I'll grab a text box control. I'll go ahead and click there on the icon that has the rectangle with the A and the B, and I'll come down into my form, and I'm going to scroll over here to the right a little bit, and I'll drop one in right about there. That creates an unbound text box that isn't linked to any underlying data table. It also brought a label along for the ride. Let's go ahead and select it. It's right here, hiding on top of this Run Report button. I'm going to select it to highlight it, and then press the Delete key on my keyboard to get rid of it. Then I can go ahead and click back onto the text box. I need to know the name of this text box in order to use it. So in the property sheet, I'll go over here to the other tab, and I'll give it a better name. I'll call it TXT Employee ID. This text box is where I'm going to type in the ID number that I'm interested in. Then I need a button to run the macro. Let's go back up here to the controls group, and I'll grab the button option. That's the one with the rectangle and the 4 X's in it. And I'll come back down into my report, and I'll click again to add in a new button. Once again, we're not going to use the command button wizard, so I'll press the cancel button to get out of that. And then on the Format tab, I'm going to give it a better text caption. Instead of Command 59, let's call it View Employee. That changes the caption here on the button. Actually, let me make it a little bit wider so we can see the full text there. And there we go. Now we can flip over to the Event tab. I'm going to create an embedded macro in the onClick event for this button. To do that, I'll click on the Build button on the far right-hand side, and it'll ask me which building method I want to use. We're going to use the macro builder and press OK. That'll create a new embedded macro, and I can see it's inside the main menu form, inside of the Command 59 button, and it's inside of the onClick event. This macro is only going to have a single step. It'll be Open Form. I'll press Enter, and that'll reveal the different arguments we can supply. The form name is going to be the employee directory. And the only other thing I need to do is give it a where condition to filter down the results. I don't want to see all the employees. I only want to see the employee where the ID number matches the one that I've typed into that text box that we just created. To do that, I'll make a reference to the employee ID value from the employee directory. I'll type in a square bracket and employee ID. And I'll close the square bracket. Then I'm going to say is equal to, and I'll make reference to that text box we just created. To do that, I first need to go into the Forms group. So I'll type in a square bracket in Forms, and a closing bracket. Next, I'll type in the separator, which is the exclamation mark, and I'll open up another square bracket. So inside of the Forms group, we'll find a form called Main Menu. I'll close the bracket after that. Inside of that main menu, we're going to go in, so I'll type in another separator, and we'll find a text box called TXT Employee ID. And I'll finish that with the closing bracket. So this is how you make reference to any object inside of your database. First, you go into the category, in this case, Forms. Inside of there, we'll find the name of the form, Main Menu, and inside of there, we'll find the name of the object, in this case, TXT Employee ID. Whatever the value is that we have typed into that text box, we're going to find the employee ID from the employee directory that matches. Let's go ahead and close the macro, and save the changes. That'll return us back to the design view for our main menu form. I can go ahead and close the property sheet. I'll save my changes, and we'll switch back into form view. And now I can test it out. Let's go ahead and type in employee ID number 1000 and press the View Employee button. And that should open up the employee directory and jump right to that employee. I'll press the Return to Main Menu button, and we'll try out another employee, how about 1050. I'll press View Employee, and we'll jump right to that person. And that's how you can pull in values from your forms into your macros. It doesn't matter if the value is coming from a text box like we did here, or a combo drop-down box, or even a label. As long as you know its name, you can reference it in the macro by looking to the Forms group, the name of the form, and then the name of the object. When creating a new macro in the design window, you might have noticed that we have this button on the ribbon that says Show All Actions. If you click on it, it doesn't look like anything has happened here in the interface. But if you start to drill into some of the actions inside of the action catalog, you'll start to see that we have a lot of new actions that we can choose from. And they all share this yellow triangle icon. All of these actions with the yellow icon will only function in a trusted database. That means that if a user has not explicitly allowed block content to run, these macro actions will fail to run as intended. Users can trust a database by saving it into a folder in their list of trusted locations, or by clicking on the Enable Content button on the yellow security warning bar that appears when the database is first opened. The reason that these actions will only run in a trusted database is because they can all either modify the structure of the database or reach outside of the database and work with external files. This makes them a powerful addition to your macro action repertoire, but you just need to make sure that you're using them appropriately. There's a lot of these different actions to choose from. You can find them in different folders here if we keep drilling down. What I want to do though is focus on one specific one called Import Export Data, and you can find that inside of the Data Import Export folder. Let's go ahead and double click on it to add it into my action list over here on the left. What I want to do is use this action to export a copy of my orders table to an archive database. I'm going to change the transfer type from import to export. The database type I'll leave as Microsoft Access, but using the drop-down menu, you can see we have lots of different options here. The database name is going to be the file path to the external database. Let's go ahead and minimize this database for a second and return back to my Chapter 3 folder in the exercise files. Here I have a database that's called Archive, and this is just a blank, empty Access database. There's nothing in it right now. I'm going to right-click on it and go into Properties. And on the Security tab, I'll go ahead and click on the object name here, and I'm going to highlight this full file path and press Ctrl-C to copy it to my clipboard. Then I'll press OK to dismiss the Properties window, and we'll go back into my database. Then I'll click on the database name property here inside of the Import Export Data action, and I'll press Ctrl-V to paste in the file path to that archive database. The object type that I want to export is in fact a table, but you can see we have different objects that we can choose from. The source table is the one that I want to export, and here I need to type in the name. So I want to export the orders table. That's the table that we have over here in the navigation pane. The destination is going to be the name of the table when it goes into the archive database. I'll call it archive orders. And finally, we have the option to export just the structure of the table, or if I say no, it'll export the data as well as the structure. Let's go ahead and save this macro. I'll call it orders archive. And that'll save it down into the navigation pane. And go ahead and close the macro now. And if I scroll down and double click on it to run it, it'll go through and complete that step. Now I can go ahead and minimize this database one more time. And we'll open up the archive database. And we'll see that we indeed do have a single table here called archive orders. And if I open it up, we can see all the data from the orders table in the other database. So all of those actions, they're officially called unsafe actions, can add a lot of functionality to your macros. And they're worth exploring if you need to move data outside of the database or manipulate the structure of your database objects. It's not very often you'll get a complex macro constructed exactly right on the first try. You're bound to get the occasional error and have to go back and investigate what the problem might be. In those cases, it'd be nice to slow the macro down and verify each step that it moves through to help isolate and identify any issues. I've gone ahead and added an additional action into the morning routine macro that we created previously in the course. Now if I double click on it to run it, we're going to get this error message that says the command or action zoom 100% isn't available now. I'll press the OK button and this macro single step window opens up. It tells me that we have an error here in the run macro command action. The only option that we have is to stop all macros from running, and that leaves us halfway through the process with just the orders table opened up. Let's go ahead and close this table down. In order to troubleshoot this macro, I'm going to open it up in Design View by right-clicking on it and choosing Design View from the pop-up menu. And then I can either read through the action steps, or I can come up here to the ribbon and toggle on this option here that says Single Step. When I click that button, it just toggles that option on, and now when I press the Run button, it'll step through the macro one action at a time. The first action that's going to process is the Open Table action, and you can see the arguments down below. It's going to open the Orders table in Datasheet view in a read-only mode. When I'm ready to execute this action, I'll just press the step button. That'll process that step. You can see the table open up here, or the query open up here in the background, and it'll go ahead to the next step of the action, which is the apply filter action. We can see its arguments down below. If we take a look at the dates here in the background, we can see that they start with January currently. I'll press the step button to process the apply filter step, and we can see that the dates in the background have now changed. The next step of the action is to set the order by clause. I'll go ahead and step into that, and we can see in the background that the dates again have now been resorted. Next, we get the run menu command action. Let's go ahead and step into that, and that's where we get our error. The command or action zoom 100% isn't available right now. So now we know exactly where in the process we're having a problem. So let's say OK. That'll return us back to the single step macro, and we can stop the macro there. Once again, I'll close the orders table, and we'll come back into our macro. Here's the step that we were having issues with, this run menu command. This action allows us to choose a number of commands from a drop-down menu that we have here. Right now I have it set to zoom 100%. Now I intended this step to apply to the report that was about to open, but we can see that it's out of order. In order to move this command down one step, I'll press on the green downward pointing arrow here, and that'll move it down below the open report step. Now we can go through and step through this macro once again. I'll go back to the design tab, make sure that the single step option is still toggled on, and press the run button again. That gives me the message here that I must save the macro before I run it, and I'll just say yes to that to save the macro. And we'll start the single step process once again, starting with open table. We'll step into that, and the table opens up. Then we'll apply our filter. We'll step into that, and we can see the dates change. We'll set the order by step. Go ahead and do that. Next, we're going to open the report. I'll step into that. And we can see that the report opens. And then finally, we get run menu command, which is going to zoom it in to 100% here on the screen. I'll step into that, and we can see it zooms in. And with that, our macro is finished, and the single step window disappears. Let's go ahead and close this report and this table. Now, the single step function is also useful in evaluating macros that include an if-then conditional step. I'm going to close this macro, and we're going to take a look at the day verification macro. If I right-click on that and open up in Design View, you remember that that was the one that also has the if-then statements. I still have single step turned on, so let's go ahead and run through this. Here we can see that we're evaluating a condition as step number 1. The condition is weekday of date is equal to 1, and you can see that it's returning a false for that. I'll step into the next step, in which case it moves on to the next condition that's also false, that weekday of date is equal to 2. We'll go to the next step, and this one is also returning a false. I'll go to the next step, and finally we get a true statement that the weekday of date is equal to 4. I'll press step again, and that'll move us into the action for this condition, the message box that returns the today is Wednesday argument. I'll press the step button again. That'll give us that actual dialog box, and I'll say OK. And again, our macro is finished. When you're done using the single step feature, make sure that you come back up here to the ribbon and toggle it back off again. That way you don't continue to step through each macro when you press the run button. And that's how you can slow down your macros to help test for bugs and identify any problem areas that you might have. When a macro encounters an error, it brings up the single step error dialog box and displays details about the error. We can see this by abusing a macro that I've created called Simple Division. Let's go and scroll down, and I'll double click on it to run it. That's going to bring up a couple of input boxes. The first one asks me for a numerator. I'll type in the number 5. I'll press enter, and then it asks me for a denominator. I'll type in the number 2 and press enter for that. And then it returns a message box that says 5 divided by 2 equals 2.5. So everything worked great there. Let's go and say OK and run that macro again. This time I'm going to enter in 5 as the numerator and 0 as the denominator. This will generate a division by 0 error. I'll say OK to that, and it'll bring up the macro single step window. It'll tell me a bunch of information about the error, and I can stop all macros. If I run that same macro again, and this time type in 5 for the numerator and the letter A for the denominator, that's going to give me a type mismatch error. I'll say OK. Once again, I get the single step window, and I can stop all macros. So in both cases, we got an error dialog box that can be pretty confusing to new Access users. But that's not the worst part. If we open up that macro in Design View and take a look at the bottom, we'll see that we had a step to remove all of the temporary variables that were set up above. Because the error occurred in this message box action, Access stopped the macro early and never got to the part where it was supposed to remove those variables from memory. In fact, they're still there, sitting in memory right now, And if that was sensitive information, someone could go in and retrieve that data from memory, and you'd never know about it. To combat the unintended consequences of a macro exiting early due to an error, it's advisable to include some sort of error handling routine. To do that, I'm going to expand the macro commands folder in the action catalog and add in a onError action. That'll add it in here to the very bottom of my list. I want this to be the first step in the macro, so I'm going to press the green up arrow a couple of times, and we'll just go ahead and follow it up until it gets to the very top of the list. Then we have a couple of options in the goTo argument. I'll use the drop-down menu to see that we have next, macro name, and fail. Next, we'll ignore the error and continue on to the next action in the macro. Fail will display the standard error dialog boxes, which is the same thing that Access does without this onError action. And finally, the option that I want to choose is macro name. This will allow you to put in the name of another macro or a sub-macro to jump over to in the event of an error. We'll give the macro the name that we want to go to as error handler. Then I'm going to come down to the very bottom of the actions, and I'll click down here at the bottom of the blank area to deselect everything. And I'll come back to the action catalog and double-click on sub-macro. The name of this sub-macro is going to be the same as the macro that we're going to, so I'll call it error handler. Inside of the sub-macro, we're going to have a message box appear, and we can fill in the arguments for it. Now, when an error is generated, Access stores details about the error in an object called macro error. We can pull information about the specific error that was generated by making reference to the macro error object and a number of properties that it contains. I want to do that in the title argument for the message box. Let's actually go ahead and scroll down on my screen to bring that up a little bit. I'll go ahead and click in the title argument, and I'm going to build a string here, so I'll type in equals and then an open double quote, and I'll say Access has generated error number, followed by a space and a closing quote. Then we're going to join this with the ampersand or the concatenation symbol to the specific error number that Access has generated. To do that, I'll make reference to the macro error object inside of square brackets. Then I'll use the separator character period here, followed by the name of the property in square brackets, number. One thing to watch out for is that separator character. With the macro error, we're referring to the property number, and since it's a property, the separator is a period. Typically at Access, we're making references to an object within a collection, such as a button on a form, or as we have up above here, the numerator variable inside of the temp variables collection. In those cases, you use the exclamation mark separator. If you use an exclamation mark as the separator here with the macro error, it won't work. It's an easy to overlook detail, so keep your eye out for that. I'll come up here to the message and we'll type in something similar. I'll say equals and then open a double quote, the word the followed by a space and a closing quote, then an ampersand, and then a reference to the macro error object and the macro name property. Once again, remembering to use the period separator. Then I'll type in another ampersand, and we'll join that to the text in double quote, macro exited early with the following description. I'll finish it with a colon, a space, and a closing double quote. Then I'll type in another ampersand, and a reference to the macro error object and the description property within. That'll piece together a text string that'll pull out the macro name, as well as the full description from the error. Then we need to make sure that we also include any cleanup that needs to occur inside of the macro, since Access won't be returning to the main portion of the macro once it jumps over to the error handler portion. So I want to make sure that I also remove all temp bars here as well. I'll add in that step, and that finishes the routine. Let's go ahead and press the Collapse All Actions button just so we can see everything on the screen at once. So we'll start with the onError action, then we'll go in and we'll set a temp bar called numerator, and we'll set a temp bar called denominator. Then we'll return the message box that divides those by each other. If any part of that returns an error, then it'll jump over here to the sub-macro called error handler. Inside of that, we'll return a message box with a clean version of the error, and then we'll finally remove all temp bars from the system memory. Let's go ahead and save this macro. And I'll close it down. And we'll try it out. This time we'll play it clean. I'll type in 5 for the numerator and 2 for the denominator, and it works just like it did before, so that works still. This time I'll type in 5 for the numerator and the letter A for the denominator. And this time we get a cleaner message. It says Access has generated error number 13, and the simple division macro exited early with the following description: type mismatch. I'll say OK, and that finishes the macro. So this time we got a much cleaner result when an error does occur. By using the error handler action at the top of the routine and adding the sub macro to move over to in the event of an error, we're able to handle the situation in a much more graceful manner. Data macros are an entirely different kind of macro. They're connected to data tables and are triggered when something changes in the table. They're most commonly used to essentially watch what gets entered into a table and then respond to that entry event by creating a log, noting the change that happened and recording the time and date when the change was made. Let's create a simple logging system to help keep track of changes that are made to H+ Sports orders table. First, we're going to need a table to store the change log in. I'll go up here to the Create tab and we'll start a new table in Design View. The first field is going to be log ID. I'll press tab to come over here to the data type field, and I'm going to choose A for auto number and come down to the next line. The second field will be the order ID, and this is where we'll store the order ID that's being changed back in the orders table. We'll choose the number data type for this. Next, we're going to have a date stamp, and the data type will be date and time. This will record when the change is happening. And finally, I'll have a field called action taken. This will be a simple short text data field. I want to set the log ID as the primary key, so I'll go ahead and select that field and press the primary key button here on the ribbon. And then I can go ahead and save the table. I'll call it orders log. So this table is where we'll save changes that are made to the orders table. Let's go ahead and close the orders log table. Then I'll open up the orders table in Design View. On the Design tab of the ribbon, I'll come to the Create Data Macros drop-down menu, and we'll see that we have lots of different triggering events. We can trigger a macro after an insert, or after an update, or after a delete, or before a delete, before a change, or it can create a named macro. Let's first deal with the situation where we're adding a new record to the orders table. I'll choose after insert. That'll open up a new macro, and you'll notice that the action catalog is completely different from what we've seen before. We have a data block section. For instance, we can create a new record or we can edit records, and then we have data actions down below. Anytime a new record is added to the orders table, I want to create a log of that in the orders log table. So I'll choose the create record data block by double clicking on it. That'll say create a record in, and then using the drop-down menu, I'll choose the orders log table. Then we just need to set each of the values of the fields in the orders log table. I'll come over here to the Add New Action drop-down menu, and I'll choose Set Field. The first field that I want to set is the order ID. I want to set it to the value of the order ID that's occurring in the orders table. So I'll make a reference to the orders table. I'll type in a period, the separator, and then the order ID field in that table. Next, we're going to set another field value. This time it'll be the date stamp field. And I'll set it to the value of a function called now. That's simply the word now, followed by an open parenthesis and a closing parenthesis. This is one of Access's built-in functions that'll return the current date and time. Finally, we're going to set one more field. This will be the action taken field. And its value will be a simple text string, so I'll type it in double quotes, order added. I can go ahead and click off of that set field action to finalize its entry. So now, anytime a new record is added into the orders table, we're going to create a new record in the orders log table, and we'll set the field value of the order ID to the order ID from the orders table. We'll set the value of the date stamp to right now, and we'll set the value of the action taken column to just the text order added. Let's go ahead and close this macro, and I'll save my changes. Next, we'll go back here to the Design tab in the orders table in Design View, and I'll go back to the Create Data Macros button. This time I want to respond to the event where we delete an order. I'll come down here and choose After Delete. Now before I click on it, I want to make sure that I read this tooltip. At the bottom it says use old.fieldName to inspect the value of the field before the record was deleted. This is going to be important in just a moment. Let's go ahead and choose the After Delete event, and then once again we're going to create a new record. I'll double click on that in the action catalog. We're going to create another record in the orders log table. Then we'll set the first field, which is the order ID field. And now the value that I want to give the order ID column in the orders log table is the value of the order that's being deleted from the orders table. This is where that old.fieldName notation comes in handy. I'll type in old.orderID. We need to reference this old object here because once this macro is running, it's after the delete, so that record has already been removed from the table. This will essentially go back in time and grab that order ID from before it was deleted. Once we've set that property, we can go down and set the next field. Once again, this is going to be the date stamp field. And just as before, we're going to use the now function. And then finally, we'll set the last field, which was action taken. And this time the value will be the text string order deleted. Let's go ahead and close this macro, and I'll save the changes. And then I'll save the changes to the table. Then I can go ahead and close the orders table, and then I'll double click on it back in the navigation pane to open it up in Datasheet view. Let's add a new record. I'll come down and press the Add New Record button. That'll take me to the very bottom, and I'll just type in a customer ID of 2000. They ordered product ID number 200. They ordered one of those. The salesperson will be 1266. I'll go and use the calendar picker and just choose today's date, and I'll say that this order was complete. Then I'll just randomly select an order to delete. How about this one right here? I'll press the delete on my keyboard, and it tells me that I'm about to delete one record. I'll say yes to that. Then we can go ahead and close the orders table, and then I'll open up the orders log to see how those changes were recorded. Here I can see the log IDs, the order IDs that were affected. I have the date stamp of when the change was made, and then I can see that one record was added and one record was deleted. Creating an automatic logging system is a great way to integrate data macros into your database. By keeping a running timestamped record, you can review when records were added or removed over time.